Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Have you ever noticed that Main Street in Lenox, Massachusetts, isn't like that of the other Berkshire towns of its size? There's something not quite right. It's charming for certain. But even when I was little, I remember walking uptown to buy candy and thinking that our Main Street was different. And then it dawned on me. Lee, Stockbridge, Great Barrington, Adams, all of the other villages of similar size have main streets lined with shops in old buildings. But not Lenox. The east side of Main Street, between Franklin and Housatonic, is lined with buildings that are younger. And what I mean by younger is less than 100 years old. It may seem funny that I think that that's young, but you'll see what I mean in a moment. Starting from Housatonic Street and going north, we have the wonderful little store called Loeb's Food Town. It's a small grocery store with a great deli. It, however, took the spot of a big Victorian house that was taken down. Beside that stands a big white house with a segmented half-circle window at its peak. It's been there for a long, long time. But then there's a new building. Then a parking lot for the post office, which is also a new building, with some shops called the Village Center. Next, however, is the big brick Mahana block. It's what is common on most Berkshire main streets. Big 3-story buildings with shops on the first floor and apartments on the top two. But not in Lenox. Here, there is only this one. Next to it, there are 2 more buildings before Franklin Street, but they are both only about 100 years old. I know, I'm acting like that's not old, but you'll see in a moment why it's not. On the opposite corner of Franklin and Main, the northern corner, there's an empty yard. It's a pretty open space, and you can imagine that it's always been that way, but it hasn't. There was once a wooden version of this classic block building style, here on this corner. It housed 3 storefronts and offices on the second floor and was erected by my own family, and called the Renier Block. It, as far as I know, burned down long ago, but its destruction was not related to this event. What event is it that changed the layout of Main Street, Lenox forever? Only the first hour of the new day had passed. It was a very early morning, April 11th, 1909, a cold, crisp Easter Sunday. But despite the peaceful darkness of the sleeping village outside, something wasn't right, for there was a glowing light of a menacing sort inside. In the basement of James Clifford & Sons Company hardware store, a number of chemical-soaked rags left in a pile had created enough warmth to combust. Not far away, backstock sat on shelves. Paint, turpentine, all sorts of oils, and 75 pounds of dynamite. George Root, his mother, and his brother all lived at the top floor of the Clifford block. The smell of smoke awoke George a little after 1 a.m. Confused at first, he soon found the source. There was an old chimney that ran up the wall of his room, and a round hole was covered over on its side, the sort of hole that an old stove would have been attached to. But on this night, smoke poured through the large cracks in the plaster that had been used to seal it shut. Suddenly alarmed, he knew full well that that old chimney was no longer in use. He sprinted out of his room and into the apartment, shouting for his mother and brother. In nothing but their nightclothes, the family left their apartment and fled down the stairs. They yelled out as they went, pounding on the doors and walls to awaken the other people that lived in the building. When they got to the front door, however, they found it engulfed in roaring flames. The fire had come up from the basement through the hollow walls, but the brothers found other courage and forced it open. The threesome ran out into the cold night air. The temperature that morning was only a little above 20 degrees. They ran in bare and slippered feet across the street for help, but they'd hardly reached the other side before an explosion tore through the building they'd just fled. In a panic, and because of the adrenaline, they'd hardly noticed that they themselves had been quite badly burnt. But they were out, and they were alive. The Clifford block was now fully engulfed, and missing a large section of its structure that had been blown away. The sound of the blast was heard as far as 6 miles away and shattered windows around the village. The fire alarm began to ring, and people, startled to waking by the sound, began emerging from their homes, looking for the cause. The red light that flickered high into the night air alerted them soon enough. There had been 5 other people in other apartments in the building. Mr. and Mrs. Horace Perel lived in the other top-floor apartment across the hall from the Root family. They'd gotten out of bed and attempted to escape after the shouts of fire from the Roots alerted them to the danger. But when they made it far enough down the stairs to view the entranceway, they saw 3 other women below. The women were standing back from the doorway, which was now fully engulfed in lapping flames. It seemed that they were debating whether or not to leap through the open doorway and risk the burns. But the Perels viewed it as unpassable. The pair shouted at the women, but the sounds of the moment were just too loud, and it seemed that the women were going to jump for it anyway. So the couple turned and ran down the back hall, out the door at the rear. There they found safety out in the open, and were free before the blast. Onlookers ran for buckets of water, sand, and ladders when they saw the figure of a woman climb from a window and onto a second-story veranda, despite her clothing and hair being aflame. She teetered toward the railing before anyone could grab anything with which to catch her, and threw herself over the side. She hit the sidewalk, but even now that she was out of the burning building, she had landed so close to the wall that even the bravest of those nearby, who tried to run close enough to pull her away, were unable. Again and again, the brutal heat drove them back. It turns out that the 3 women that Mr. and Mrs. Perel had seen never leapt through that burning front doorway. They'd instead fallen through the weakened floor into the basement, the very epicenter of the blast. The Clifford building sent fire high into the air, and as it is that fire creates its own weather, the flames began to turn and lap at the building next door, to the south, the Eddy building. The people within its walls had been tossed from their beds by the blast and had fled outside directly afterwards, so the building was empty when it too began to burn. The shocked tenants stood across the street in their robes and hastily grabbed shawls, shivering and watching the fire take all that they'd worked for. Some of those items include plans drawn up for the construction on the Robert W. Patterson Place, the new Lenox High School, and other grand summer homes by the Cliffords, which were stored in the Clifford block. Those constructions would be delayed until the plans could be redrawn, and many people in the business of construction would be put out of work for the time. By now you might expect the fire department to come roaring along with its old-fashioned horse-drawn fire coach, equipped with hand-pumped water tank and hose. Well, Lenox didn't have any of that yet. In fact, all the town had was a tiny volunteer department, and the only equipment they had to speak of were ladders and buckets that they could muster from their own homes. They had to wait for someone from Lenox to alert the departments in Pittsfield, Lee, and Richmond to suit up and to make their way to Lenox Village before any real headway could be made in extinguishing the blaze. Meanwhile, a 3rd building, the Mahana, caught as the flames began to really take over the Eddy building. Then, in due time, it was passed along to the Bull building. The fire had crept as far as the opposite side of Main Street from the Academy, and was racing by then. Onlookers feared that it would reach the library and the Curtis Hotel. Most everyone from the hotel, prominent people visiting for the Easter holiday, had already come out to see what was going on. They'd suspected that someone might have been using dynamite to rob the Lenox National Bank across the street, but they discovered the real reason when they got out into the chill of the night air. But again there was the library in the way of the flames. Should they make a run for it and try to save the rare books and old maps, the documents? 7 of the great elms that stretched along Main Street, famous for their size and grace, were burning like everything else. Thankfully, and suddenly, the winds changed and blew the flames back in the direction they'd come. The change of direction drew the flames toward Church Street, behind the burning structures on Main Street, and caught fire to the homes of Mrs. M. Colbert and Joseph Gilbert, or Joseph Renier. I found 2 differing reports. The new direction also threatened the Tillotson livery. The stable was full of valuable and cherished horses, and people sprinted down Franklin Street to rescue them. The doors were thrown open, and the animals driven out. Spooked by the flames, many of them scattered into the night and out of sight. Onlookers with homes out of the way of danger saw no reason that those displaced should be left to shiver and witness the destruction of their dwellings, and so bundled them up and brought them away to the warmth and safety of the Curtis Hotel. Mrs. Lindsay Fairfax even undertook a subscription paper and was able to raise $2,600 for the victims, a tidy sum in that time. By that same evening, a fund was set into motion and a meeting arranged for the next morning in New York City to raise $10,000 from the summer residents of this beloved village for those displaced and for the restoration of the main street. Finally, as the morning light began to displace that of the fires, the firefighters of the nearby towns came racing in like champions on chariots to fight back the infernos. They fought the flames best they could, but by that time the first buildings were beginning to burn themselves out. It was finally cool enough for the body of the woman who had jumped from the veranda to be recovered from the sidewalk. She was identified as Miss Alice French, who was 41 years old and worked as a bookkeeper. The great elm trees that were damaged by the flames would later have to be taken down. A few were lucky enough to only need a severe pruning. The village business district was most severely damaged, but a few smaller dwellings were destroyed as well. Somehow the fire didn't destroy the carriage barn and blacksmith shop between the buildings that burnt on Main Street and those destroyed on Church Street. This building still stands today as 69 Church Street. It took days to find all of the horses that were released from the livery. Later estimates of the total damage of the fire were $250,000, but all told, there was only $111,000 worth of insurance coverage. It had only taken an hour for all of the buildings destroyed to catch fire beyond saving. 6 lives were lost altogether, and they were all from the Clifton block. They consisted of Miss Isabel Cook, 40 years old, a bookkeeper, and her friend who'd been visiting, Miss Alice French, 41 years old, a bookkeeper. She was buried at the Pittsfield Cemetery. Miss Mary Sparks, 26 years old, a school teacher at the Lenox Public School. Edward C. Ventress, 41 years old, an electrician. His wife, Willina, 35 years old, and their daughter, Leslie, 12 years old. They were buried in the Corinthian Cemetery in Cornith, Penobscot County, Maine. Cleanup and building took a long while. The 2 buildings on Church Street, one owned by either Joseph Gilbert or Joseph Renier, and the other owned by Mrs. M. Colbert, formerly 83 and 87 Church Street, were nothing but ruins. The lots were sold, and a new building was put up in 1911 that took up both spaces, creating the modern 71 Church Street. The white building on Main Street, with the segmented half-circle window at its peak, was all right, other than some shattered windows, and the fact that the side facing the fire was so blackened that the stark white outline of each shutter was left behind when they were closed against the drifting soot the next morning. All the other buildings were completely demolished, save the Mahana building. Its brick skin stood tall against the cold sky, but steady. It was determined that its facade would be saved. The debris was shoveled out, the brick scrubbed, and eventually, what was left of the outer shell was filled again, with apartments and shops. The other newly opened areas were cleaned up and filled with newer construction, like the current building that contains O'Brien's Market. It was first called Cowhig and Gregory's Market, and the building to its right, which now houses Frankie's Restaurant, was a simple house when first constructed. The post office was for a long time housed in the old courthouse, which had been moved to its new spot on the corner of Housatonic and Church Street, the same building in which my great-uncle housed his Renier store. But the post office would later be moved to land opened up by this fire, a long brick building with a large open parking lot. Many of the buildings put up were later pulled down again and replaced anyway. The village suddenly had a newfound changeability, for it's easy to tear down something new that lacks history. The main street could become anything, really. One thing that changed for the better, though, is that Lenox would have a full-time fire department. It was directed that the building should be constructed beside the new town hall on Walker Street, and that all the equipment for such an endeavor should be acquired, like a new LaFrance fire truck. Ever since it and the 2 other fire stations were installed, one in New Lenox and one in Lenoxdale, they've watched loyally over the town and its villages. If you want to see the outcome of the Great Easter Fire of 1909, I advise you walk around Lenox Village. It's pretty easy to spot the buildings that don't fit. They're simply too new. But Lenox is beautiful, and if anything, this smoldering piece of its long story only makes it more fascinating. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. If you'd like to contact us, find more episodes, or see images related to our topics, please visit our Facebook page, or visit our new website at www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.